Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. I'm Maki Park, Senior Policy Analyst for Early Education and Care at the Migration Policy Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this conversation. This webinar's title is Effectively Serving Immigrant and Dual Language Learner Families Through Home Visiting Programs. I wanted to go over a few quick logistical notes before we get started with the conversation. First, if you are running into any technical difficulties now or over the course of the webinar, please email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or call us at 202-266-1929 so we can help you out. I also want to let you know that we'll be holding a question and answer period at the end of the call. This will not be a voice Q&A, but will be moderated via chat. So please type any questions into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen and send either to the host or to myself. You can also email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. Alternatively, if you are on Twitter, you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or use hashtag #MPIDiscuss. And these questions can come in anytime over the course of the webinar. I am privileged today to have the opportunity to be speaking alongside our distinguished presenters, Jamie Colvard, Senior Technical Assistant Specialist at 0 to 3, and Pamela Williams, the Washington State Program Director for ParentChild Plus. I'll be introducing both of our speakers momentarily, but first wanted to give you all a bit of an introduction and context to the topic of our discussion today, and also provide an overview of the policy brief that we're releasing on this same topic. So we are hosting this webinar here at the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, where our work covers a range of issues impacting immigrant and refugee outcomes here in the United States. My work at MPI focuses on early childhood policies that promote the healthy development and success of young children of immigrants and refugees, as well as dual language learners. We're releasing a brief today that looks at how home visiting services are reaching immigrant and DLL families in an effort to understand what some of the key barriers to participation might be for these populations, as well as potential opportunities to expand access and quality to better meet their needs. The brief emerged directly from a finding out of the recent National Academy of Sciences report, Fostering School Success for English Learners, that found that DLL families were underparticipating in home visiting services overall. We discuss in the brief why immigrant and DLL families are such an important target for these holistic two-generation services, what some of the barriers to their equal participation might be, as well as opportunities to improve and expand services for these populations. I know that many of you on the call may be new to the home visiting field, and I'm happy to say that Jamie will later be giving us a quick expert overview on the ins and outs of home visiting in her presentation, so I won't be delving too much into that background in these beginning remarks. But I did want to start off first by illustrating the large and growing share of young children of immigrants and DLLs within the young child population overall in the United States. So in the US, young children of immigrants, who we define as being all young children who have at least one foreign-born parent, now make up over 1 in 4 of all young children in the US. And most of these young children are US citizens. You see in the slide that I've also said that dual language learners, or DLLs, make up an even larger proportion of the young child population nationally, coming in at nearly 1 in 3. And we define dual language learners as any young child who has at least one parent in the home who speaks a language other than English. And therefore, this child has the potential to develop bilingualism and biliteracy if supported in their home language. Not only do these young children make up a significant proportion of the overall population, but their growth has been extremely rapid. So in fact, children of immigrants have accounted for all of the net growth among the young child population since 1990. Children of immigrants across the US are also increasingly coming from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds, which is important to note in terms of thinking about access to services and service delivery. So while Spanish is still by far the most predominant language spoken in most DLL families, many lower incidence languages are increasingly represented across many states and communities, leading to what we refer to as a state of super diversity. And across the board, children of immigrants and DLLs are still less likely to be enrolled in pre-K and early childhood services compared to their peers, although research has shown that they may particularly benefit from participation in high-quality early childhood programs. Finally, children of immigrants and refugees are also more likely than their peers to have had exposure to trauma and other stressors, either trauma of a primary and/or a secondary nature, which we know can significantly impact their development and can also affect maternal health and parenting practices. Turning quickly to immigrant parents of young children, in this slide we see young children in immigrant families are disproportionately likely to be living in low-income households, and they're also more than twice as likely to lack health insurance compared to their native peers. Many immigrant parents of young children are also limited English proficient and/or have lower levels of educational attainment, all of which makes these parents a key target for home visiting and other interventions, given the strong correlation between parental educational attainment and future educational outcomes for young children. And as many of you likely know, home visiting programs are very well placed to address these risks, as Jamie will be discussing. And home visiting especially is a very promising intervention in our view to support immigrant and DLL families in particular, because of their mode of delivery and because they're based on a relationship-based model. They can, if they are implemented effectively, be a particularly successful way to reach families that might otherwise be highly isolated and quote-unquote hard to reach. We've heard from many providers that this is the only way that they would reach some of the immigrant communities that they're serving. This is partially because many home visiting programs very effectively utilize staff that are recruited directly from the communities they serve with a shared cultural and linguistic background with their clients. And once such a relationship is in place, home visitors can serve as a touch point to the wide range of services that immigrant and refugee families may need but not have access to. And in this way, they take on the work of coaching them in systems and cultural navigation that could otherwise be really challenging and restrictive for an immigrant family that's recently arrived or has limited English proficiency and limited cultural knowledge or social networks. Home visiting is also an important model in considering the development of language skills. We all know about the research that points to the importance of the earliest years for brain and language development, but many parents continue to receive misinformation about the detriments of speaking in their home language to their children. Home visitors can play a critical role in making sure that parents are supported and encouraged in their role as their children's first teacher and promoting the importance of home language development as a critical foundation for the development of future English language skills. Home visiting programs are also unique in their ability to address intergenerational trauma and maternal mental health challenges and provide mental health supports, both outside of a clinical setting as well as through warm referrals to mental health providers. As you all likely know, mental health issues are often stigmatized in different cultures, including our own in the US, and the ability to address the challenges that immigrant and refugee mothers may be facing in a comfortable and normalized setting can go a very long way in mitigating some of the negative effects of maternal depression and anxiety and uncovering more serious issues that might otherwise go unaddressed. Finally, the skills, the knowledge, and resources that immigrant parents can gain through home visitors can be invaluable in transforming the way that they engage with their children's educational experience for the rest of their lives. I think we're all aware of the challenges of engaging diverse families in the K-12 arena, where there are fewer opportunities for genuine relationship building and authentic communication, especially with parents from different backgrounds. So the foundation that can be built in these early years is critical to empower parents to become advocates for their children throughout the rest of their educational careers. However, in spite of the promise and potential of home visiting in reaching immigrant families, we do know from existing research that these populations are currently underserved by home visiting programs and are not a targeted or priority population under MCV at a national level. There's also very little evidence of effectiveness of home visiting programs or models specifically for immigrant or limited English proficient families, either through HomeV or elsewhere. So as is often the case for this population, a lack of data represents a significant barrier to improving services, as states and localities are not required to report data on home languages or English proficiency of those they serve. And we discussed this in greater detail in the policy brief. And while we don't know for certain why this gap in participation for immigrant and LEP families exists, we do have quite a bit of evidence that, especially now, many immigrant families, whether they're mixed status, authorized or unauthorized, may be fearful of accessing programs, even when there are no explicit eligibility barriers. There's also evidence that in instances where programs lack a more diverse staff and also lack pointed cultural training, home visitors may themselves be resistant to engaging with immigrant and refugee families and have either explicit or implicit biases that prevent them from working effectively with these populations. This is, of course, compounded by language and communication difficulties. For such a relational program, clear communication is essential to success, so language skills and language access are really critical. Overall, it's important to recognize that home visiting can be an incredibly positive model to work with diverse families if implemented thoughtfully. But in the opposite scenario, it can be a very harmful and alienating experience for families given how the practice of parenting as a whole is so deeply embedded in culture. So without a full understanding of these differences, home visitors can be in danger of making their clients feel that their culturally rooted approaches to parenting are not acceptable in the U.S., or that their knowledge of their own children is not valued. So some of the recommendations that are laid out in the policy brief as opportunities to expand high-quality home visiting services for immigrant families are really in response to these barriers. First, at a policy level, states have an important opportunity to include immigrant and DLL-related indicators, such as home languages spoken, as part of their upcoming state needs assessment that will need to be submitted for the federal McV program in 2020. This is the first time that these needs assessments will be updated since the inception of the program, and making these families visible at the policy level so that administrators and programs can understand potential gaps in services will be critical to ensuring that diverse families are served equitably. This lack of data and information about immigrant families in home visiting programs can be addressed also at the program level to contribute to the knowledge base about how diverse families fare in home visiting services. Information about home languages spoken or limited English proficiency could also be included, for example, in national evaluations or the National Home Visiting Yearbook. The next piece about leveraging partnerships with trusted cultural brokers is something that I think Pamela will be talking about in discussing her work. Partnering with community organizations that have existing relationships with diverse families and have those deep cultural skills and connections can be a key factor for success in working successfully with immigrant families. Employing a diverse staff that has those crucial linguistic and cultural skills and reflects the communities that are being served is also an important way that programs and models can expand their reach to diverse communities. Professional development specifically related to cultural competence is also an important element to incentivize at the policy level and to center as an important building block of program quality. Diverse staff have a unique opportunity to help provide home language support for parents who are best placed to offer this support to their young children, but might not be doing so, as I said, due to misinformation. But even those staff who do not speak languages other than English can offer information about the benefits of home language development, as well as providing books and other resources for parents to utilize in their interactions with their children, which can have a significant impact for young dual language learners. And then finally, going back to the issue of trauma, taking a trauma-informed approach and integrating trauma-informed tenets into home visiting practices can also have a significant positive impact. And this may be especially true for immigrant and refugee families who are more likely to have experienced exposure to trauma. We do have a previously released brief from a few months ago specifically on this topic that you all can refer to as well. So that's a quick overview of the brief that's coming out today. And I'm happy now to turn this over to Jamie Colvard. Jamie is a Senior Technical Assistance Specialist with the 0 to 3 Policy Center, where she supports state and community leaders to develop comprehensive early childhood systems that support young children and their families. Her work focuses on issues including home visiting, early childhood mental health, early care and education, and cross-agency collaboration. In the past, she's also worked with grant makers for children, youth, and families, and also held several managerial positions with a regional law firm in California. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today to share your expertise with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. So like Maki said, I'm going to spend some time just giving an overview of home visiting, some of the history of how it's grown in the United States, and some of the benefits that it has for families and systems. So whenever I'm giving a talk like this, I always want to root us in the, why are we talking about the earliest years? So we know from the science that our brains grow faster between the ages of 0 and 3 than any later point in life. forming more than 1 million new neural connections every second. And babies' earliest relationships and experiences shape the very architecture of their brains, building the foundation for future development and learning. So they all need good health, strong families, and positive early learning experiences in order to thrive. And that is actually 0 to 3's policy agenda. Especially during the early years, parents play the most active and influential role in their baby's healthy growth and development. And as I'm sure many of you who are parents know, parenting is difficult even in the best of circumstances. When families are facing additional stressors such as poverty or health or mental health concerns, unemployment, or social isolation, it becomes even more challenging. But home visiting has been demonstrated to be an effective method of supporting expectant parents and parents of young children to really support their young children's development during these critical early years, particularly when it's part of a more comprehensive and coordinated system of services. So what is home visiting? Well, it's not a really straightforward answer. There are many different models and home visiting programs, and they vary in goals and content of services. But in general, home visiting is a two-generation approach that delivers both parent and child-oriented services to support the full family. And as you can see from this little infographic, oh, I just realized it has our old logo on it, sorry. But as you can see from this infographic, the things in the windows of the house sort of demonstrate some of the things home visiting will focus on. So some of the supports might be providing parenting support and information about child development and early learning. Home visitors often work with parents to do developmental screenings or social-emotional screenings to kind of check in on their child's development. As you heard earlier, play a critical role in helping families navigate the system, which is really important for families that may be, for immigrants who may be newer to the community, or even families who have multiple needs, and our systems are often so complex, so helping them navigate that. Also connecting them to services, both for children and parents, and really looking at public benefits that the family may be eligible for, such as SNAP or child care subsidies, support around health. So the home visitor is really there to just support the family fully and to really help them support their children. Regardless of the model or the program that's being implemented, there are some things that are kind of across the board the same. One is that home visiting is voluntary and like we said, delivered in the home or sometimes at other locations chosen by families. It really is relationship-based and driven by the family's needs. And often it's offered over a longer period of time, maybe a full year or longer. So there's time for the home visitor and the family to build that relationship and that trust, which is so important for having those conversations. Depending on the program model, home visitors may be nurses, social workers, early childhood specialists. Sometimes they're also community health workers or promotoras, and sometimes it may be people paired together to work with families. So if we look across the robust research on various home visiting models, there's several strong themes about impacts that emerge. So keep in mind what I said earlier, that specific models sort of vary in their program structures, their intended outcomes, and kind of the content, their program model, and populations that they're targeting. So the impacts, may differ depending on the goals of the model. But as you see on the slide here, home visiting really can impact a great swath of outcomes for young children and families that are so important for their future development. Through their work, home visiting can support children's increased school readiness. It can also enhance parents' abilities to support their children's development, which is really what's influencing that first one, the school readiness piece. And it's also shown outcomes on health and development. So an example may just be home visitors may work with expectant parents to baby-proof their homes, and that can decrease the number of accidents that occur. improving family economic self-sufficiency. Often home visitors will work with parents to think about a plan for looking at their own sort of growth, maybe in schooling or in changing their profession or obtaining a job if they're currently unemployed, and sort of develop goals and then help them over time to pursue those and make outcomes there. It's also been shown to have great impact on maternal health outcomes, both during the prenatal period, better outcomes for attending prenatal visits, maybe supporting that, also birth outcomes, and then, as mentioned earlier, really supporting parents who may experience maternal depression, both, sort of identifying that, serving as a resource to support the parents during those early years or early months that can be really challenging, even without any extra stressors, and then being able to connect families who might need more intensive support. Also, when you look sort of at some of our nation's costliest social problems like child abuse and neglect, school failure, unemployment, crime, a lot of these are rooted in early childhood, and research shows that voluntary home visiting can impact them. It can lead to fewer children in the juvenile justice system, or lower rates of child abuse and neglect. So even looking beyond the wonderful outcomes that can occur for children and families themselves, when you look at state-level outcomes or the outcomes on costs for a state, there are positives there as well. So I have a bullet here with one example of a study by the RAND Corporation that looked at the cost-benefit data for a couple home visiting programs and found savings ranging from $1.80 to $5.70. So that's the return for every dollar invested in home visiting. I'll say that one thing that complicates this sometimes is that often the return for home visiting, like so many investments in early childhood, may happen in other systems and not the system where the money is put forward. And then I'll just say, yet, despite the fact that we know all of this, home visiting is still reaching such a small portion of our families who could benefit. And home visiting, is not a new concept. We might not have always called it home visiting, but it's really been a popular delivery mechanism for over 100 years. We've seen locally developed programs grow to meet specific community needs. That continues to happen today. We've seen the establishment of some of the most commonly known evidence-based models in the last, 50 years. Models like Healthy Start, Healthy Families America, Nurse-Family Partnership. Those models often put time and money into research and evaluation, and also created national centers to sort of support replication. And all of that great work has really paved the way for new federal investments in home visiting. So in 2010 is when the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program was created. It's now been reauthorized twice. Along with that was the establishment of the Home Visiting Evidence of Effectiveness, which really reviewed all the research from home visiting programs and identified a list of what they called the evidence-based programs that states could really use their MCFE funds to invest in. MCFE also allows states to use up to 25% of their MCFE funding for promising practices. These are programs that may not have a robust evaluation yet, but are still building towards that. And then I'll also mention that MCFE included a 3% set aside to create the tribal home visiting program, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. As MCFE has really built up home visiting across the country, states, communities, and private funders have, leveraged that and also increased funding to try and reach more families and build systems. And just a few emerging issues and considerations I wanted to share. So, McPhee was this great infusion and focus on home visiting in states, and states have really leveraged that to strengthen systems for home visiting and the early childhood system as a whole. Some of the ways they've done this is to look at how families are entering the system and try to make that a smoother, more equitable process that really helps families reach the most appropriate services and programs. So they've some have done this by creating central intake and referral systems that'll really route folks to the places that are most helpful for them. States have also invested in data systems. McPhee has a very robust evaluation component. There are benchmarks that states report data on. And so in creating the systems to track all of that, many have been very thoughtful to try and include state-funded home visiting programs in those systems and even connect it to other early childhood data systems to try and get a better sense, of a child's experience and how the different things they may be interacting with are affecting their outcomes. And then I'd say states are increasingly thinking about a full continuum of home visiting that includes universal home visiting, maybe a visit whenever a new child is born to a family, and then the more targeted home visiting that's more intensive and over a longer length of time, and thinking about, how you sort of look at that full scope of home visiting and how it connects to other services. And then, I mentioned the tribal grantee program because I think they've done some really wonderful things to look at how they can adapt and enhance home visiting to really be more appropriate for their communities. And because the research on home visiting is not specific to tribal populations, they had greater leeway to choose models that are on that list or look at promising practices, and have really worked with their communities as they're determining which models to implement and how to implement them to make sure that they're culturally responsive and relevant and are really supporting families where they are. And I'll just end. I just wanted to put up a few resources, additional resources here in case you're interested. The first one there, the research case for home visiting, goes deeper into the research and can give you more information about the benefits of home visiting. The tribal home visiting website is up there, and I listed 2 of the papers that might be interesting to look at. I think you can draw some lessons from how tribes have enhanced home visiting to think about how things may need to be adapted when working with this population. And then the home visiting yearbook that was mentioned earlier, and then our website for home visiting. So I'll stop there and turn things over to Pam, or back to Maki.
Great, thank you. So now we're delighted to have Pamela Williams join us to talk about her program. She serves as the ParentChild Plus Washington State Program Director, and in that role supports a diverse group of organizations statewide that are implementing the ParentChild Plus core and family child care models.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Pam.
Thank you. Hi. All righty. Well, thank you so much for having me to be a part of this panel and to share the beautiful work that ParentChild Plus is doing in Washington State. Before I get started, I'm just going to give you a little background on what ParentChild Plus is and how we operate as a home visiting program. ParentChild Plus was formerly known as the ParentChild Home Program. We've just recently gone through a rebranding to really reflect all of the work that we do as an organization to serve families. And so through that, we're now called ParentChild Plus. And through that, we recognize that if we're going to address inequities, we needed to start early in the life of toddlers and their caregivers. And the plus in ParentChild Plus is our work as social equity agents. And so we began early in the life of vulnerable toddlers and their parents to create a pathway of possibility. And so I think Jamie just talked about the history of home visiting, and it's been 100 years old. ParentChild Plus, formerly known as ParentChild Home, PCHP, was formed in 1965. So we've been doing this work for quite some time. And through all this time, we've been working with under-resourced families and offering them skills and tools to help their children thrive through life and in school. The way in which ParentChild Plus operates, and so ParentChild Plus has two streams of work, home visiting and work with family child care, but the way in which we do our work for our home visiting is that it is designed to provide one-to-one modeling of reading and play with the parent and child together. And the person who's doing the modeling is what we call is the home visitor, and as we call within ParentChild Plus, the early learning specialist. We offer families 2 program cycles, which what we used to say 2 years, and each program cycle of service constitutes 23 weeks at a minimum. And we visit those families 2 times a week, and each visit is a half an hour, 30 minutes long. Each week, the family receives a gift of educational book or toy, and by the time the family leaves and completes our program, they would have received at least 92 visits and 46 educational books and toys. And when we're talking about under-resourced families, what a wonderful thing to begin having a children's library, some really good educational toys that these children will see when they go into kindergarten. And they would have had a chance to experience playing with them, with their parents. Parents have an opportunity to engage with their children early in life. Families are also, while they're in our program, the early learning specialists connect them to other community resources and support services, as Jamie referenced in her speaking time. As we talked about the diversity of families, ParentChild Plus serves families that speak a wide range of languages. So we try to offer them curriculum that supports the home language and culture identity of the families in which we serve. And later on, I'll show you the list of agencies and the cultures and languages in which they support. 71% of our Washington ParentChild Plus program staff speak over 2 or more languages, and 25% of our current staff are former program participants. Our early learning specialists are normally hired from within the community, making them uniquely suited to understand the culture and language of the diverse families with whom they work. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work in Washington State. I love working with this team. It's an amazing group of people that I work with. And so we're going to talk about who we serve. So let me just give you a little bit of background on Washington State itself. So Washington State has around 7.5 million people, and almost 69% of them are Caucasian, and 14% are foreign-born. We serve 2 counties in Washington State. We will be serving 3 come this new year, but the 2 counties in which we provide services are King and Yakima. Yakima County is the area that has our oldest program. It is an area in the state where the majority of families are Spanish-speaking, and most of them are working in the orchards. It's a very agricultural community. And King County is the largest county in the state, and it's the most diverse linguistically in the state. And at one point, it was one of the most diverse linguistically in the country. So as you can see in King County, 22% of the population is foreign-born. and almost 27% speak languages other than English. And in Yakima County, you can see that 18% are foreign-born, but 40% of households speak a language other than English. So this makes us poised to really provide services with ParentChild Plus in these communities. So I'm just giving you just a little breakdown. So in Yakima, we serve around 45 families. In King County, we serve almost 1,300 families. And out of all of those families, 58% of our custodial parents cannot speak English. And because ParentChild Plus works with the not just the primary parents, sometimes we work with an auntie, a grandmom, whoever is in taking care of the child in which we're working with. So there are other parents, and we collect data on those family members. 67% of those adults, additional adults in that child's life, do not speak English. ParentChild Plus families speak over 50 languages. And this beautiful piece of art was drawn by one of our coordinators at the Children's Home Society in the south part of King County. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, we've had a very large expansion around 2 years ago. King County put together an initiative called Best Starts for Kids. And it was voted by the citizens. And the goal of this initiative was to improve the health and well-being of King County youth. The largest investment of the dollars from BSK, which is Best Start, was in the prenatal to 5 arena. And ParentChild Plus was the recipient, one of the largest recipients of investments in home visits. And so what did this mean to our program in King County? Before the investment, we were providing services to families and through 8 large community-based organizations. And all of them had connections to community, but through Best Starts for Kids investment, we wanted to connect deeper into community. It was one of the goals of BSK to reach deep within community and to connect and support smaller community-based organizations who were trusted by the community they serve. And these agencies also reflect linguistically and culturally the communities in which they were providing services. So we went from serving families with 8 large agencies. We moved to 17 agencies. 6 of our original 8 had expanded, and we brought on 9 new, smaller CDOs. And the beautiful thing about this was these agencies normally would never apply for this type of funding because they were never looked at as viable candidates for funding, and so to be funded. And so I think the initiative with BSK really allowed us to dig deep and to really reach out to reach families that we wanted to serve. And so if you look on this slide here, you can take a look and see at all the agencies that we serve. You can look at the focus population and the area of the county, and this is just about King County again. We brought on agencies, one of our larger agencies that was specific to serve Chinese, Vietnamese, and East Indian families was CISD, and they expanded. But some of our newer agencies that came on board was Congolese Integration Network. Congolese Integration Network was a brand new agency. It had only been in existence a couple of months, and they were eligible to apply to provide services, and their goal was to reach out to the Congolese refugee and community and to provide services for those family members that were feeling very disconnected and connecting them to resources, and ParentChild Plus was one of the resources they wanted to offer them. So the children were ready and parents were ready for the educational system in America. Another agency, Horn of Africa Services, that services East African as well as Horn of Africa. We also work with Iraqi Community Center, and they work with Arabic-speaking families. We also have West African Community Council, who serves West African immigrant families. So you can see the great diversity, and it's a rich encounter when we get together to talk about how we're serving families in the community, and we're able to share resources and support as we serve families through the ParentChild Plus program. We are seeing, through the work that we've been doing with families in King County, that it's working. And we were able to do a research study, and we were able to see that we are narrowing the gap, preparation gap for those children in which we serve. And so our children were showing there was an assessment that's used for kindergarten preparedness for the state of Washington called WAKIT. And it has 6 domains in which they look at children's preparedness for kindergarten. And our graduates, compared to in a comparison group, showed ready in all 6 domains of this assessment. Also, as you can see, that we talked about the diversity of languages service in home languages. Our children that did not speak English performed well on another assessment that is given to children as they enter kindergarten for English language proficiency. And again, they demonstrated a high level of English proficiency on the assessment tool called the Washington English Language Proficiency Assessment, which the acronym is WELPA. And one of the things that we were really not surprised, but it was very affirming to see that our graduates that were now in 3rd grade at the time of this assessment were performing well in math and reading. And that our children in regards to math were at the same level and a little bit better than state level performance. And so it's a wonderful thing to see that this approach has really made a difference with families while we're with them and long-term preparing them for school and life success. So that is my overview of ParentChild Plus, and I'll turn this back to Maki.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. It's always so inspiring to hear about the exciting and innovative work that you're doing, and you've been such a great resource to us in this work. And I think this presentation will spur a lot of motivation and thoughtful discussion. For those of you who do have questions for either or both of our presenters, we do now have about 17 minutes left to address questions from you all. Again, we would invite you to use the Q&A function on your screen or email events@migrationpolicy.org or tweet to @migrationpolicy or use the hashtag MPIDiscuss. We do have several questions lined up here to begin. And I'll start first with a question that was asked about the new public charge rule in regards to immigration policy and how that should be handled among home visiting programs. And I don't want to get too granular into this since it could be a freestanding topic for a webinar, but I will say that first, the new public charge rule affects a very small proportion of immigrants. It only affects those who are seeking permanent resident status through family member petitions. And for those families, they should likely consult with an immigration expert or lawyer to see where they stand on these issues. But by and large, early childhood, early learning programs are not affected by public charge as the rule currently stands. It does not affect MCV. It does not affect Head Start. So that's an important message to send. And there are several outreach toolkits and fact sheets that are available that we would encourage you to access and can send those along as well for those who are interested. The Protecting Immigrant Families campaign that's housed at CLASP has a toolkit specifically for early childhood providers that includes all the information that should be needed there. So thank you for that question. We also have 2 questions specifically around workforce issues. I was going to pitch this first question to Jamie. It's a broader question about workforce quality. And the question states that the quality of the workforce is incredibly important to success of a home visiting program. So something we didn't talk very much about yet is, besides a focus on basic childhood development and trauma-informed care, which we did mention, what other content areas, skills, or dispositions are really needed among home visitors in order for them to be effective? And Pamela, would love to have you chime in as well if you'd like to jump in from your on-the-ground experience, but Jamie, wanted to turn that question to you first.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say, and I think that's been on the minds of states as well. One thing I didn't mention was that several have created sort of core competencies for home visitors that really do, draw on both, like you said, kind of the child development knowledge, the skill set behind our knowledge and expertise behind it, but also the relationship-based piece is so important. One area where we see a lot of overlap is with our infant and early childhood mental health work. So that's an area that I think several states have looked at, trying to support their home visitors to have a better understanding both of child development issues, but also social and emotional development and health, and also mental health issues for parents. We do have a few articles on our website that give examples of state core competencies for home visitors. So I'm happy to send those as a follow-up if that would be helpful. I think it's also a nice way for states to sometimes align those with other early childhood professionals, such as Part C early intervention, infant mental health clinicians, and early care and education to kind of see what goes across.
Great, thanks so much for that response, Jamie. And it would be great, yeah, we should be able to connect folks with additional resources following the webinar. There was also a question specifically about potential curricula and initiatives that we would want to lift up in terms of provision of professional development on cultural competency and taking a trauma-informed approach. And what kinds of elements are important for cultural competency training, which is also a big question. And Pamela, I was going to ask if maybe you could elaborate more on how that happens in your program. I did want to mention on the trauma-informed piece, I mentioned that we put out a brief recently specifically on this issue where we highlighted a few programs that are specifically working with refugee families in taking a trauma-informed approach and providing socioemotional and mental health supports on a two-generation level. And one of these programs that we mentioned was Baby Talk, coming out of Illinois. But we can send a link along to those resources as well. But Pamela, could you speak to the professional development piece and what that looks like in terms of developing cultural competency among your home visitors?
Okay, well, within ParentChild Plus, our design is that each site meets weekly to talk about issues related to families and understanding maybe cultural nuances that may arise during a visit, so there's a greater understanding of a behavior that might just be something that's happening in the family, that's a cultural behavior that we may not understand. So when we do assessments, a lot of the assessments, of course, are written through a Eurocentric lens, and we spend time talking about what does this mean in your culture? How would this behavior that we're looking for be manifested in your culture so that we're not scoring families based on a Eurocentric lens. So that's one of the things. We also offer professional development throughout the year, at least 2 or 3 times a year on various topics, and we try to always infuse culture and cultural nuances in the way we do the work. So it's something that we just really try to braid in, and it's not just an outlier. It's always infused in everything that we do. I don't know if that fully answers your question. That's the way we do our work.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. And actually, there are a few questions, actually, which I think this is a big question for a lot of folks. On the one hand, people are asking about how multiple languages are handled. But for coming out of your presentation, I think there's a question also about how your program manages to secure the funding for interpretation, especially for languages other than Spanish and English. knowing how that requires significant resources. And I don't know if you have funding dedicated to that issue or if you could address how you make that happen.
So in regards to interpretation of visits, the visits are done in, if the family speaks another language, we try to secure an early learning specialist that speaks the language of the home. And then if they don't, the family should have some proficiency in English, but the goal is always to be able to allow the family to speak in their home language, and we try to provide them with an early learning specialist who does that. So it really puts the onus on agencies to hire the correct staff, and so that's one piece. In regards to translation of papers and forms, that's still a big lift. Some agencies internally, based on, with the budgets that they get to operate ParentChild Plus, will internally be able to make translations of forms. But that is still something that we're still working on at the national level because it is a very big, expensive venture to translate everything in all the languages in which we service. But we're slowly collecting them and putting them on our national database as resources for agencies across the nation.
Great, thank you. Yes, there's a lot of interest in how these partnerships were formed. I've seen one question asking, how did you locate these community-based organizations that are working so closely with immigrant families? And then in a more pointed question, there was an inquiry about what the process looked like for smaller CBOs to apply for funding, since this, I think, is a unique thing that's being done. How did the CBOs become eligible, and was it done through a county RFP process? Could you speak a little bit more to how that was managed through Best Starts?
Sure. So the funder is the funding comes from Best Starts and the City of Seattle and United Way, and United Way is the actual funder of agencies. So there was an RFP put out through United Way channels, Best Starts channels, as well as City of Seattle, and they've reached out to the community at large and encouraged all providers to come. And I think the biggest lift was to get the smaller CBOs to come because they know traditionally they're not funded. And I remember having a conversation with one of the providers after the meeting saying, is it worth me spending money to get someone to help me write a grant because they normally don't fund us? And to have to get them to believe that, yes, this is a real opportunity for you to be funded. And so I think after this first group of funding went out, I think a lot of the smaller CBOs were no longer afraid to put their hats in the ring for funding. But, yeah, we had community meetings across the county. We had at least 4 or 5 community meetings allowing agencies to come. We gave them an overview of the model. And United Way talked about themselves as a funder. BSK talked about them as a funder and the mission of the work of how BSK saw the work coming out for the county. And they were allowed to ask multiple questions. They were also provided with TA support when it was time for grant applications. The county and United Way provided TA support to the smaller CBOs as they were writing their grant applications as well.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, this is really exciting work happening in King County that at least we at MPI, we haven't seen similar initiatives pop up elsewhere, and this is something that we're really hoping is taken up in other areas as well. I have another broader question for Jamie. For folks who are less familiar with the home visiting model, there was a question about the focus of home visiting on families' needs and how exactly home visitors position themselves to be able to learn from families about their own knowledge and resources. And related to that, I just wanted to raise up a comment that was brought up from someone on the line saying that home visiting is also increasingly being taken up in the K-12 arena to help support parent engagement there, which is absolutely right. But along those lines, Jamie, could you speak to some of the strategies that home visitors take on to try and learn from families about their own knowledge and skill sets?
Sure. I mean, I think going back to this idea that it really is relationship-based is really what drives the interactions. So I think when a home visitor goes and meets a family for the first time, they're coming in with the perspective of not, I'm here to help and I've already identified all these things I'm going to do and this is what you need. It's more of starting as a listener and, getting to know the family and maybe, explain a bit about what they can do with the family, but really letting the family drive that. And like Pam shared, modeling behavior and working with parents in that way is a key piece of it. But I think home visitors have done a good job of sort of thinking about it's not us, needing to go in and share what we or the system thinks that families need. It's really letting them drive that. Certainly home visiting models may have specific pieces that they're trying to address or supposed to do, but it really needs to come from the families. And I'll just say one other piece that I think is important is that sometimes families may think, they may not see clearly the different parts of the system. So home visitors also really need to differentiate themselves from, say, the child welfare system. Sometimes families have fear of someone coming into their home. They think they're, coming to see, am I a good parent? They're going to, find out I'm not, something bad's going to happen. So really making clear at the very outset that that is not the role of these home visitors, and they're there as a support for families, and that it's okay to ask for help, that that's not a negative thing.
And can I just add, that is true for immigrant and native-born families. That is something, a fear that most have, that you're going to report them if you don't see something exactly, if they're not exactly perfect parents. They're not perfect.
Great. Thanks so much for that great overview. We have room for a few additional questions. We have one question about whether there are states that are using kindergarten entry assessments in languages other than English, making the point that so much research does point to the focus on home language in the early years. So pushing toward English proficiency is not always ideal and might conflict with a home language focus. And this is something that we at MPI have been pushing on for a long time, that very few states indeed are offering kindergarten entry assessments in languages other than English. And even those that are offered are likely to be potentially in Spanish, rarely also in Chinese, which leaves a lot of other lower incidence languages unaddressed. As well as, even those states that are only offering assessments in English could be offering guidelines, at least for those families who aren't speaking English in the home, to be able to conduct the assessment in a way that would account for the fact that the child does not speak English. But that guidance also is lacking, which is something that we found as we put out a series of dual language learner state fact sheets that we're looking at how states are addressing DLLs in their state policies. So this is a huge gap in looking at how pre-K programs and intentions can transfer into the K-12 arena. And accurate assessment is a huge issue for dual language learners, not only in terms of thinking about entry into kindergarten and the awareness of teachers of young children's language environment, but also in thinking about early intervention. And we know that there's a huge issue with DLLs either being over-referred or under-referred to early intervention services, which can really affect negatively the trajectory of their educational careers. So thank you for raising that. And then I think the last question that we have time for is about, there was a question about whether, Pam, your program is an evidence-based program. And I would love to have you just speak a little bit about what that means and the process that ParentChild Plus is going through. I wanted to mention that part of the issue that we raised in our policy brief is the fact that many of the evidence-based programs, or in general the way that HomeV is determining what an evidence-based program is, does not necessarily capture the experiences of minority populations. And this is something that we think is really important to address. So there's a very rigorous process that programs need to go through in order to become MICV approved. And as Jamie said, there's a separate process in a way for tribal programs because they might have different needs, and the programs that are high quality for those populations might look different. And arguably that's true for a lot of minority populations, and I think this is something that's not being sufficiently addressed in the process of making programs evidence-based. But Pamela, do you want to talk a little bit about what that means for ParentChild Plus?
Sure. So if you ask ParentChild Plus, we are evidence-based. We've done rigorous research on our program, but we have not yet made the Humvee list. We're waiting for a review of all of our data, and we're waiting patiently for them to do that. So on the Humvee list, we're not. But we are considered in our state evidence-informed because there's a lot of research around our program. We have a lot of evidence of the work that we've done. But in regards to, as Maki so eloquently stated, we are not on that particular list, but we're on multiple lists in education, other arenas. And so, yeah, it can be a limitation, but it doesn't, I don't think that should define who should be funded, because I think the evidence should be proving, our evidence of the way in which we've done our work should prove that we are effective in serving families. And Humvee, I think, is just one avenue of looking at that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pam. And I'm so sorry to say that that's about all the time that we have for this discussion today. To those of you who have questions that have remained unanswered, I do apologize. We simply received too many to address in the time that we had, but we will follow up with you via email with responses. I also want to let you know that slides and audio from today's webinar will be available at www.migrationpolicy.org/events. And finally, for any reporters on the call who have further questions, please reach out to our Communications Director, Michelle Middlestat, at 202-266-1910. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and especially to our speakers. Thank you so much for your presentations and for your time. Bye, everyone.